This is Jeremy from the Next Big Idea Club, and I am here with Jonathan Haidt, the co-author with Greg Lukianoff of the recent Next Big Idea Club finalist, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. So Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. So for those who may not be as familiar with this book or your work, tell us a little bit about how this idea, how the idea for the book first came about.
So Greg Lukianoff, my friend and the first author, was the first to really notice that something strange began happening on college campuses around 2014. I've been a professor. I'm a professor at NYU in the business school, the Stern School. I was at the University of Virginia for 16 years before then. I love teaching. I love being a professor. And there's a lot of trust with students. We're in this not exactly sheltered place, but it's a separate place. We have our own norms. We can be provocative. We can tell jokes. It's been wonderful to, most people love being in college and it's great to be a college professor. But suddenly, from out of nowhere, in 2014, weird stuff started happening. And Greg was one of the first to notice it. So Greg is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. It defends the free speech rights of college students. And it was always the administrators who were violating those rights out of fear of lawsuits and don't cause trouble. And Greg's organization always defended them. But suddenly in 2014, students began saying, that book is dangerous. Don't teach it, or give us a warning if you're going to teach it, or this speaker is dangerous. They were acting like words were physically dangerous to them. And this was very strange, but Greg had a unique insight because Greg is prone to depression, and he had a true suicidal depression in 2007. He was hospitalized. And when he was released, he learned cognitive behavioral therapy. And in CBT, you learn to recognize catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, black and white thinking, all these things. My favorite description of CBT is from Homer Simpson. In one of the Simpsons episodes, he says, "Shut up, brain, or I'll stab you with a Q-tip." We have that feeling, of like I can't make myself stop. So Greg went through that. And he learned CBT, where you learn to challenge these distortions. Well, so Greg goes back to his job, and then fast forward again to 2013, 2014, he sees students thinking this way. And he calls me up because he'd read my book, The Happiness Hypothesis, where I talked about CBT. And he says, "John, if somehow colleges are teaching students to think in this distorted way, isn't that going to make them depressed?" And I thought this was a brilliant idea because I had just begun seeing some signs of this in students, and I was reading about the strange things happening, requests for trigger warnings and safe spaces. So I joined Greg in writing this up. We submitted it to the Atlantic magazine. It came out in 2015 in August, and there was a great discussion around it. And then all hell broke loose on campus at Halloween. Some of your viewers may remember that there were these big protests at Yale over an email that a professor had written about whether students should make their own decision, and it was a big mess. It's very confusing. But the issue of students requesting or demanding protection from words, speakers, and ideas became much bigger after our article came out. And so that's why we ended up turning it into a book, because these problems have spread out from the university as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I found especially interesting about that story you just told was you mentioned some of these cognitive distortions that you go even more into in your book. And from what I understand, there's 9 big ones. So what are, not that you have to go through all 9, but can you tell us a little bit more about what a few of the most prominent ones are and how those play out on college campuses?
Okay, sure. Okay, so mind reading. You assume that you know what people think without having sufficient evidence of their thoughts. He thinks I'm a loser. And so one of the interesting things about what happened on campus was that students would request safe spaces or trigger warnings, not for themselves. It wasn't like I will be traumatized. It was my friends or vulnerable people will be traumatized. But did anybody check with them? Not necessarily. What's another one? Oh, catastrophizing. You believe that what happens will be so awful, you won't be able to stand it. If somebody reads, if a novel is assigned that triggers a memory of a traumatic episode for, if a student had been sexually assaulted, let's say, and there's a Greek myth that involves rape. Myths often involve rape. there was this new idea that students are so fragile, and this was what was new. Students are so fragile that if they hear something that reminds them, it will be unpleasant. And if they experience this, they will have a full-scale attack of PTSD. Therefore, we've got to protect them. Now, this is catastrophizing. This is just not the way PTSD works. And I don't know of any cases where a student had a PTSD attack and had to be hospitalized because of a book. Like I haven't even heard those anecdotes. So again, something else was going on here. Students had somehow accepted the idea that we're all fragile, that the world's a dangerous and oppressive place, even at Yale, even in the most protective, progressive environments. And so they demanded changes that I think have really sucked the life and the trust and the fun out of higher ed. For what purpose? It isn't clear that this has helped anyone.
Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating about that is that you're saying that people are now equating words and phrases with acts of physical violence, and I think that really, and as a former literature major myself, it seems that I and people like me like to use this metaphor of using words as weapons,
Right.
and we're going to make changes, and it seems like there's this underlying metaphor of like, if we just use the right words, then we can create physical changes and create physical damage to whatever power structures are problematic or et cetera, et cetera. And so at what point did this metaphor of words as weapons become literalized? Like, how did that happen exactly?
So here, I think what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to go down into childhood, because when Greg and I wrote our article, we thought that this was caused on campus, like somehow, maybe certain ways of thinking about oppression and victimization are causing certain patterns of thinking with external locus of, like we had all kinds of theories about how college caused this. And in 2014, while we were writing the essay, I was responsible for finding the data on mental health, and I couldn't do it. Everybody was saying that there's a rise of mental health problems on campus, but there was no data I could find that proved that. Well, 2 or 3 years later, there's a ton of data because it was happening. It really began around 2013, 2014, and it wasn't just on campus. This was happening to all American teens, rich and poor, black and white, male and female, but especially female, much more the girls than the boys. So it turns out this problem did not start on campus. We have basically kids born in 1996 and later had really different childhoods from kids born before. Now, from looking at you, I'm guessing you're a millennial. How old are you, if I may ask, Jeremy?
Yeah, I'm 25. I was born at the end of 93.
Okay, so you're the very end of the millennial generation. Millennials tend to love the book because a lot of people talk about millennial snowflakes, but no, actually, this is not about the millennials. You millennials had no problem with a controversial speaker. You didn't freak out and try to shut it down. It really begins when Gen Z arrives on campus in 2013, 2014, depending on how you count it. Gen Z arrives on campus, and this is when this phase change, this new morality takes place. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, these terrible kids. It's not like that. It's actually, what did we do to our kids that made them vulnerable in this way? And so let's back out of college. Let's go back to the 1990s. I'm 55 years old, and it was really clear to me in the 90s, this is the best decade in history. I mean, the Cold War was over. I grew up with a real fear of nuclear war. Like, we really thought that the Earth could end, like 50% chance. I mean, it was scary. Gone, that whole fear, gone. The budget, surplus. Like, whoever thought we'd run a surplus? Like, the 90s was amazing. And guess what? The crime rate plummeted. We in the 80s, we thought it was just going to go up and up and up, and the cities were going to be unlivable. But no, we still don't know why. I think it was because we banned leaded gas in 1980, and kids didn't have brain damage, but put that aside. The crime is plummeting in the 90s. It's fantastic. And the music was pretty good, too.
Music was great.
So the 90s were great. And if you look at the risk that kids were at from anything, any kind of disease, car accidents, crime, it's plummeting. It's the safest time ever. But what do we do? Because it changes the media environment, we're divorced from reality. But what we get is a steady diet of stories of childhood abductions. Now, almost nobody gets abducted in the United States. There are about 100 true kidnappings a year in a country of 350 million people. It almost never happens. But each time it happens, especially if it's to a white middle-class kid, There's, constant coverage for a variety of reasons. In the 1990s, just as childhood was the safest it had ever been, we freak out and we say, if you ever take your eyes off your kid, he'll be kidnapped and killed. And so we can't ever take our eyes off our kids. Now, in the 90s, as far as I know, nobody was arrested because their kids were caught playing at a park. That wasn't the thing that happened in the 90s. That begins happening in the early 2000s. But if you think about it, the only way it could begin happening is if, in say 2006, nobody had seen a child outside unsupervised in 10 years.
Wow.
That's what happened. So because we changed our norms in the 90s, and kids born in 95, 96, when they grew up, and I do this demonstration all over the country, I ask the older people, at what age were you let out? Everybody was let out to play without supervision at the age of 6, 7, or 8. That was the universal across the country, in other countries. But then I ask the Gen Z, and they say 10, 11, 12, sometimes 13 or 14, sometimes 8, but usually it's 10 to 12. So we took the main period of childhood. This is the period when kids go forth and have adventures unsupervised. This age is about 7 to 11 or 12. That's the main period of childhood adventure, when they learn to be independent, when they learn to manage risk for themselves. I'm going to climb up this wall. This looks fun, but oh, wait, maybe I'm going too high. You make the decision for yourself rather than saying, well, my mom will tell me if I'm going too high. We deprived kids. So millennials are the last people in America who got some unsupervised time, so we really weakened Gen Z. All right, then this same generation, as they're growing up, we get the Columbine shooting, and then we put on anti-bullying policies. So now teasing, you can't tease in school. That's considered bullying. So my kids go to New York City public schools, no teasing. Often there's no running at recess because someone might get hurt. If anyone cries at recess, the guard will come over. What's going on, kids? Kids don't have a chance. They don't have 10,000 chances to work out conflicts for themselves. All right, so then the same generation that is deprived of learning experience, they're led on social media way too early. So we overprotect them in the physical world, but we underprotect them. We say, hey, here's this new way that you can all be connected and you can all punish each other, humiliate each other, whatever you want. We have no idea what you're doing. Just destroy each other. Who knows what'll happen? It's a big experiment. Let's find out. And so that's what we did. Now in 2006, 2007, Facebook isn't so toxic and very few middle school kids are on it. But between 2009, 2011, that's when American teens go from mostly not on social media every day to mostly on social media every day. And in 2012 is when all the curves start spiking upwards for depression and anxiety, especially for girls. Wow. So I think if you look at the combination of overprotection, denial of ability to learn and grow strong, anti-bullying policies, too early on social media, shaming, reputational destruction, call-out culture. So Gen Z shows up on campus 2013, 2014. They don't have the normal social abilities that previous generations had. What is dangerous to them? Nothing physical. What's dangerous to them is now words.
Right.
So we don't know for sure. This is all very complicated, but that's the story we tell in the book. And I think it's valid, of what happened to Gen Z and why they're so different from the millennials.
Yeah, I think that there's so much to unpack there, but that makes so much sense. And I think, especially at the end there, you clarified so beautifully how it is that metaphor of words as weapons has become literal, because in many ways it is the environment of social media where Gen Z encounters danger of any sort, right? That's right. Because that's where they don't have any supervision. So that's where they experience pain and humiliation and ostracization. And so all of a sudden their reality is, their whole idea of what danger looks like.
They grew up like in the Matrix. They're growing up in this virtual, this consensual.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yep. So that's so fascinating. And so then what exactly happens then when these Gen Z students move from the campus into the corporate world or the business world? How does that play out?
Yeah. So when we wrote our article in 2015, a lot of people said, oh, come on. This is just college students being college students and being goofy in college. As soon as they go out into the real world, they can't do this in a company. They're not going to ask for trigger warnings and safe spaces. I mean, they're going to have to toughen up, right? And we said, I don't know. We'll find out. Well, if Gen Z arrived on campus, let's say September 2014, plus or minus a year or two, then they just graduated in May of 2018. And so they've only been in the corporate world for about a year, again, plus or minus. And it's, it's a pretty sharp cutoff, but no cutoff is exactly 1 year. So there's a few transition years, basically starting the year after you were born. So you're a millennial. And so what I'm hearing, I work in a business school, I meet a lot of business people. What I'm hearing, I always ask, like, so do you have any recent college grads? How's it going? And what I hear is that it's often very difficult. What I hear is things like, it's like, my God, like, it's like some of them, they come in like looking for conflict because they grew up in a call-out culture. And here's the key thing about a call-out culture. You put all these kids linked together, and in some areas of it, some subcultures, you get prestige by pointing out that someone else has done something wrong. Somebody else has used words inappropriately. And a real hallmark of a call-out culture is that it's usually not an idea. It's usually about a word. It's usually about a single word or phrase that somebody thinks is insensitive. And they do it publicly. Now, if you actually want to change people, and there's research on this, if you actually want to change people, you should go privately and talk to them. But if you shame them publicly, they're going to back off in shame, but they're going to hate you and they're going to hate your cause. So in a whole bunch of ways, there was just an article in the New York Times by a Black woman who works for reproductive rights, by her own definition, a social justice activist, saying call-out culture backfires. Don't do this. This is really toxic. This is the way to hurt your cause. But here's the thing. You don't actually care about your cause as much as you care about your own prestige. So, if social media puts you in a kind of a prestige economy in which shaming and attacking others gets you points, well, that's what you're going to do. And if everyone's looking to shame and attack everyone else, you're going to try to signal things that say, I'm good, I'm cool, I'm, orthodox, I have the right beliefs. And so when companies hire members of Gen Z, what I'm hearing is that there's just so much time now spent on the fact that somebody said something. Now, anytime you're working with human beings, there's conflict. There's politics, there's misunderstandings. That's always the case. But let's suppose that typically 5 to 10% of all productive hours in an office are burned up by stupid conflicts that are not necessary and that don't lead to anything good. Let's suppose it's been 5 to 10% for a long time. Well, if it suddenly goes to 10 or 20%, that's a huge hit on productivity. It's a huge hit on how much fun it is to work in an office. And so I think what's happening at universities, where in those few years, we're more on eggshells, we have to self-censor more, we can't trust each other as much. That same thing, I think, is coming into companies. I don't want to overstep here because I hear, I don't have data on this. I hear anecdotes from people in various industries, and it varies by industry. But this is my prediction. This is what we're seeing the beginning of, that the same campus problems are moving into companies, at least in those industries that hire from elite American universities. So media, arts, tech, journalism, it's happening there. In finance and mining and manufacturing, probably not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm so glad that you touched on this point about how this whole pattern of public shaming, it indicates that those groups care more about their personal prestige than they do about their cause. And a related point that I wanted to ask you about, and this is something that I see on Facebook just all the time, as I'm sure many of us do, is that it seems like there's this almost drug-like appeal of moral outrage and righteous indignation. Like it just feels so good to be like, I'm right, this person's wrong, and they are a bad person. And it just seems to me that that there's like this very human instinct to want to fight against something, anything, even if that means that you have to start tilting at windmills, right? And I think you even see that in the stories that we've been telling for millennia in our myths and legends and religions, and all the way up to the movies and books that we consume nowadays, where it's always this struggle of like good versus evil, and the hero always triumphs, and it just feels so good to place yourself in the role of that hero. So, I mean, would you say that that's true? Like, do you think that the appeal of that righteous indignation is a big part of what's happening here?
Yes, I think that's. I was about to say exactly right, but I'm going to put a little twist on it. You're right that every culture that has a writing just about, has left us a major epic that's a hero's journey. And the hero goes through various stages and becomes stronger, and then goes and fights evil and vanquishes evil. So that's very deep in the human mind. But what we're seeing on social media, what we're seeing with Gen Z is not exactly that, because it's not an individual hero. There are very few individual heroes, or even very few individual activists who are becoming known. It's group versus group. It's a mob. I shouldn't say mob necessarily, but it's tribalism. It's a group. So what I observed in the 90s was when, as soon as we were deprived of an enemy, when we no longer had, originally, Hitler and Japan, and then we go to the Soviets and communism. Once we were deprived of an external enemy, in the 90s, we were desperately looking for an enemy. We tried drug dealers. We tried, not Al-Qaeda, this was before Al-Qaeda, but we tried Islamic terrorists. Nothing really stuck. We didn't have any good enemies in the 90s. And so it's very deep in the human mind to do us versus them. My last book was called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And my argument is we evolved to be religious. We evolved to do small-scale religion, not like big religions with big sky gods, but small-scale religion where we worship something sacred. It binds us together, and then we're ready to fight another group. And so if you look at a college football game and all the rituals that go on beforehand, it's great fun. You bind the group together, you do battle, and then afterwards you can go home and you can forget it. So it can be playful, or it can consume your life. And so as formal religion is fading out, as young people are increasingly choosing the designation spiritual but not religious, people who are deeply embedded in a traditional religion, I think, are not as vulnerable to this. But there's a huge crisis of meaning among young people and millennials too. I hear this about millennials as well. Huge hunger for meaning, a sense of emptiness. And so if new political doctrines come along, if a new crusade, a new campaign, so it could be the campaign to fight global warming or to fight racism. Now, these are great things to fight, but if it becomes a religion, it's going to affect you in ways that's going to warp your thinking. It's going to actually prevent you from actually solving the problem. So I do think that Gen Z and millennials to some extent, well, millennials, you were more pragmatic. You guys were starting businesses, you were doing all sorts of things. But I think political causes are going to loom much larger for Gen Z. And look, this is not their fault. I mean, they're growing up in a completely insane time. I mean, the president, okay, I don't want to get political, but just, it's a completely insane time. And so for them to be upset about what's happening in the country, yeah, they're right. So I think they're going to be drawn into, the old thing from the 60s that the personal is political, which is a terrible way to live. It's terrible for your happiness, and it's not good for your activism either. But I think that young people, Gen Z, will be drawn into this.
That makes total sense. And it seems to me also that there's this conflation between political disagreements and moral disagreements, where the political becomes not just personal, but it becomes moral. And like at this point, especially with some of the policies of our current president, it seems like a discussion of politics inevitably boils down to a discussion of morality. And I know that this is also an area of specialty for you. So is this conflation of politics and morality, is that something that just is, and we're now just recognizing it? Or is that something that we're kind of imposing on the discussion a little bit?
Okay. So once again, I'll say, yes, I'd say that's basically right, but let me shift it over one notch in this way. Politics has always been moral. So, our left-right dimension goes back to the French Revolution, and in the assembly, one side sat on one, and it wasn't like, oh, we disagree on policy, but, we're friends. No, they were, killing each other. So politics has always been about morality, but it varies in the degree to which it is about moral purity and sacredness and good versus evil in a way that requires me or us to destroy you, versus a milder form in which they are our opponents, but not necessarily our enemies. And if you look at, there's very good data in the United States on political polarization. And if you look at what's called affective polarization, so don't look at what you think about issues. Look at what do you think about Republicans? What do you think about Democrats? And the data shows that Republicans and Democrats always had a slightly negative opinion of each other on average, but it wasn't hatred. It wasn't the bottom of the scale. It's only around 2004 that the numbers really begin rising in terms of, do you rate these people at the bottom of the, I hate them. I really feel I hate these people. That only really begins rising in the early 2000s, and it's kept rising up through 2019. when you really, really hate the other people, now you dehumanize them. Mm-hmm. Now they have no ideas that are worth listening to. They are, if you're on the right, they are all racists. And if you're on the left, they hate America. They're traitors. They're, lazy. But it's like, what are the sacred values? So it's sort of race, and then America tends to be the thing that the two sides sacralize. Mm. And when the other side is not just wrong, they're not just your opponents in a game, they are evil beyond redemption. Mm. So far, there's been not a lot of actual violence, thank God, but I think we're getting closer to that. Yeah. You don't want to kill people unless they are so evil. The other thing that happens when purity and pollution comes in is, what I'm finding is that young people, for example, Gen Z and maybe millennials to some extent, they're much more likely to make arguments that are ad hominem or guilt by association. So when the Coddling the American Mind came out, we were expecting a lot of really smart people to argue against us, to show us where we're wrong. And there are only about I can point to 3 to 5 places where someone made a good argument, like that we might have missed something. Overwhelmingly, the argument is, we're bad people. We're straight white men. I am right adjacent because I am a centrist, and so geometrically speaking, I am right adjacent. That's true. Left adjacent too, but I am right. But the arguments if you look at the reviews, there were a lot of good reviews. There were 2 very negative reviews, but they overwhelmingly are making ad hominem attacks and guilt by association. So this is what you do in a religious war. This is not what you do in a classroom or a debating society. Right.
So it seems like all of what we're talking about here, I'm noticing that all of it seems to stem from the rise of sensational, attention-grabbing media, which makes us more fearful of kidnappings when we don't need to be, and then also obviously contributes to political polarization. So it seems like a lot of what you're talking about really just stems from, well, yes, the decline of traditional religion, but the rise of this kind of media that we've since become addicted to. And so, would you say that that's a fair comment, or is it more complicated?
No, I think that's, again, basically right. I'll just add some nuance.
Sure.
So in general, throughout history, there have been innovations that link us closer together or that increase mobility. And whenever that happens, there's all kinds of unforeseen effects. So the automobile, people can move around. It changes sex life and dating and marriage. It changes So the automobile, the telephone, the airplane, all of these things have effects on society. And it takes decades for that to work out. No technology has ever come in as fast as social media. So the internet came in, over, 5 or 10 years. Social media goes from not at all to, once iPhones come out and smartphones, so smartphone penetration and social media, we've never had something that was coming in so fast and that was so transformative in changing social relationships. So just to be clear, I love the internet, I love my iPhone, and if we'd stopped at that, we would have problems caused by these things, but I think they would be solvable problems. I believe that it is social media specific. It's not the internet, and it's not just screen time. It's specifically social media that has pushed us over the edge. I think it is a major cause of the rise of depression and anxiety for girls. Research that I'm collecting shows it's not time spent watching Netflix that's doing it. It's not even time on a computer. It's specifically social media. That's what causes the big curves of rising mental health problems. So had Facebook and Instagram and Twitter never been invented, I do not think our politics would have blown up. I do not think Donald Trump would be president. I do not think Brexit would have happened. I do not think that our democracy would be as imperiled as it is. Of course, Facebook and Twitter do a lot of good things. I use Twitter. I learn a lot from it. Facebook. So, these are all really complicated, but I think the downside is so severe that I'm beginning to worry that social media is incompatible with a functioning democracy. Again, I'm not making predictions. I can't say that with great confidence, but I'm beginning to worry that we may never get this worked out.
I totally hear that. Yeah. Actually, just last year, I did an interview with virtual reality pioneer Jaron Lanier. I don't know if you're familiar with this guy. Yeah. He came out with a book called 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now. And he actually goes even further, and he says that, in his opinion, finding a new, better way to do social media is really an existential issue, because we're starting to enter such radically different realities that we gotta figure this out. We gotta do better.
That's right. So that's a very clear way to put it. So imagine that democracy is always fragile. Plato said that democracy is the second worst form of government because it inevitably decays into tyranny. It literally means rule of the demos, the people, the crowd. And Plato, like the founding fathers, knew that the crowd, the mob, the people are so easily led astray by a demagogue, by a person who inflames their emotions. And so we're seeing that all over the world. In a lot of countries, demagogues are rising to power. So let's suppose that it's always been pretty tough to have an effective democracy. It's obviously possible, we did it, but there may not be a lot of margin for error. So here we are, 20th century, America has an amazing run. We are the envy of the world. A lot of countries model their constitutions on ours. The 1990s comes along, oh my God, the end of history. We did it, we won. If Iran and North Korea, just let them get wealthy and they'll become liberal democracies too, obviously. Well, we were so wrong. We were so wrong. So instead of that way of thinking, imagine that the founding fathers were right. Imagine that Madison was right when he said that direct democracies, at least, they have ever been, cauldrons of, anger and discontent, and are inevitably as short in their lives as they've been violent in their deaths, something like that. So imagine that the founding fathers were right. And if you get things exactly right, you can do it. And they tried, and they did a good job of it. But now, let's take a Bunsen burner underneath. Let's just heat it up. Let's just heat it up 100 degrees hot. Let's just make it real hot, okay? Let's make everyone really angry, and let's see what happens. Let's take this democracy where it's really hard to all be on the same page, and we're huge and we're diverse, but we had 3 television networks. We had some really respected newspapers. Let's take all that. Let's rip that all up. To hell with that. Let's put everybody, let's just shred the social fabric. Nobody will ever be on the same page as half the people again. Well, we're just lots of different separate communities, all full of hatred, all moving in different directions. Let's try it. Let's see what happens. And that basically, I think, is what has happened to America since about 2009.
Wow. Yeah. That is, I wish that metaphor weren't so perfect, and yet it really is. So well said, well said. So in our last 5 minutes or so, I thought we could turn to some questions that were actually submitted by Next Big Idea Club members, because I know a lot of them have read your book and they've absolutely loved it. So, so one comes to us from Brian Sano. And he says, I've been working a lot on building a culture of psychological safety in the Treasury and State Departments, encouraging people to share their ideas and concerns and create a culture that does so as well. But I was recently talking with a colleague about this, and he feared younger employees would equate it with safety issues in our colleges. And just to add something myself here, one of our very first Next Big Idea Club selections was The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. Great book.
Oh, I don't know that. It sounds good.
It's excellent. And he makes the case that one thing that makes business cultures, or really any culture, effective is this whole notion of psychological safety, where it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to voice, to put a stupid idea out there, and you won't be made fun of for it. Right. And so I think it's interesting because on the one hand, it sounds like psychological safety is a really good thing, but on the other hand, these quote unquote safe spaces that you write about may not be. So how do you differentiate those two things?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. Thank you, Brian. So psychological safety is a major concept in the organizational literature, organizational psych literature, and it has a real meaning. If you feel like I'm going to put my idea out and I'm going to be, criticized or shot down, I'm not going to contribute as much. The problem is that there's a process called concept creep, in which for Gen Z, now we raised them this way. We told them, do you feel safe? Do you feel unsafe? I mean, if somebody's teasing you, you might feel unsafe. We told them the world is dangerous. Don't talk to strangers. They might, stranger danger. People are dangerous. So we taught them to see everything. Now, remember, they lived in the safest world that has ever been on this planet. And we taught them to see everything as a matter of safety versus danger. So we did this to them. They come to college, now they see ideas in terms of safety versus danger. So psychological safety has a certain meaning for, especially for Gen X and older, and for millennials. But for Gen Z, safety, well, look, if I feel unsafe, there's no negotiating here. The person in charge has to protect me. this is an absolute obligation. It's not like I shouldn't need to explain why I feel unsafe. So I would urge all businesses to stop using the word safety, because it has a very different meaning to Gen Z. And I would think instead that, I should think this through more deeply, but like we need an alternative word, and it might be cooperation. That is, we need a culture of cooperation. A culture of cooperation means we understand we're all in this together, we need each other, and if you suggest an idea, I'm not going to say that's stupid. I'm going to say, oh, I'm going to be more welcoming. So what we need to focus on is how do we create cooperation in a group that has divergent interests, divergent background, divergent race and gender. So I would focus on cooperation, because I believe that all the forces blowing apart our country, the forces blowing apart any group, they've always been there. They're so much stronger in the age of social media. And now as Gen Z comes in, it's going to be also difficult. So I would urge you, keep going, Brian, to build a culture that welcomes ideas and challenges and dissent especially, but stop using the word safety. It has a very powerful, very different meaning for Gen Z.
I love that answer. And it strikes me that cooperation is a great word to use there. I also wonder if cultivating a culture of just respect is another good one. Because
I don't know about respect, because
oh really?
Because respect, the idea that so many of our interactions are disrespectful. Again, it's I think it might be a little bit related to call-out culture. I would focus more on concepts that make us feel we're all in the same boat. So in the book, we talk about the importance. So you have to have identity politics. There have to be issues by which groups can press their needs and concerns. But we talk about the power of common humanity identity politics. Anything that says we're all in this together, we're all human beings, we're all IBM employees or whatever it is, start there. And now you can work out the conflicts and problems. But if you start by you're making me feel unsafe, or you're disrespecting me, respect is much better than safety. But I think you really want to do something that really starts with the idea not of conflict but of commonality.
Yes, that makes total sense. Love it. And we had one other question from another Next Big Idea Club member, which I wanted to bring in. This one comes to us from Samantha Wunderlich. And she says, is there any evidence that the culture of safetyism is shifting? And if so, for better or worse? And perhaps more importantly, what can be done on a larger scale to help that transformation happen?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what she meant by shifting. I suspect it's just getting worse and worse. There are certain trends. As a country gets wealthier and as they have fewer children, they invest more in their children. And then they worry about them more. And if you have 4 kids, and lots of other people have 3 or 4 kids, you send them out and they all play. But when everybody has 1 kid, as happens in China and Korea and other places, and America to some extent, and as we have rising inequality, we have more pressure to get into college. So for a variety of reasons, these trends of seeing childhood as we're all investing in you to get you into college, and we're going to keep you safe. We don't want anything to happen to you. Not go out and get strong, scrape your knee, climb a tree. So I think it's very hard to reverse the culture of safetyism. What I'm hoping will do it is the recent statistics on suicide and self-harm. Now that it's clear that there's an epidemic of self-harm, especially, is very clear. The girls' suicide rate in the United States, teenage girls, is up 70%, which is way more than older women. The boys' suicide rate is up about 25 to 30%, but that's actually in line with older men. But once you see what's happening, especially for self-harm in the US, Canada, the UK, it's happening in all the countries I've looked at. This is I don't know if it's global, but it's in the English-speaking countries. Now that it's clear that our kids, it's not just that they're unhappy, it's that they're actually being hospitalized for self-harm and for suicide attempts. This is so serious that I think we're going to have to really take it seriously and reevaluate what we're doing. So I co-founded an organization. It was really founded by Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids. So if your viewers go to letgrow.org, letgrow.org, it's really Lenore's brainchild, but we've got to give kids the chance to learn to be strong. Kids are anti-fragile. If we protect them, like we raise them in a bubble, their immune system doesn't develop. And in the same way, if we protect them from teasing, exclusion, everything bad socially, then their social strength doesn't develop. So kids need a lot more free play, a lot more independence. They have to learn from experience, not from lectures. So I think we've really got to change what we're doing to kids. And I think that the mental health stats are going to be what forces people to reevaluate, because we can't ignore this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so then maybe one last question to close with here, Jonathan. You know, it seems like we've talked about a lot of these issues on such a big scale. You know, we're talking about the entire country, sometimes the entire world. Yeah. And so, you know, for anybody watching this video or later reading the article, what would you say each of us can start doing right now to start encouraging that, you know, these values of free thinking and healthy debate, you know, on our campuses and in our offices?
Sure. So for one thing, I think everybody who interacts with other human beings needs to read Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. We need to remember these basic social skills of how do you start a conversation, how do you avoid arguments. That's one. Two, I think most of us need to spend less time on social media because people are still pretty reasonable and decent when you meet them offline. I think we need to get more off social media, more connected to people, more morally and intellectually humble. It's very hard to find the truth. And there are all these forces acting on you to make you overconfident and angry and moralistic. So I think we need to drain a lot of the passion and the moralism out of our social interactions. If we do that, I think we might get through this. But I'm very concerned about the basic state of human social interaction. Other specific advice, especially for anyone who's a parent out there, everybody is wondering, what do I do about device time, social media? Some specific advice for those who are raising kids, if you want to raise stronger kids, go to Let Grow, learn about giving them more free play. But in terms of technology guidance, what I would suggest is 3 simple rules. 1, all screens out of the bedroom at a certain time every night, because a lot of kids get distracted overnight. It interferes with sleep. Give them at least 8 hours, 10 hours a day where there's no distraction to sleep. 2, no social media, I think until 16, although that's unreasonable right now. But for God's sakes, don't let them get a social media account before the age of 13. It's the preteen girls who have by far the largest increases in depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide. So the evidence is still a little bit mixed on this, although I have a lit review. I think it's pretty strongly showing some causality here. So keep kids off social media as long as you can, especially if you can talk to their friends, parents, and their school, because it's hard to do as an individual. And then the third rule is work out a time budget with your kids. So I don't know if that means 2 hours a day. There's no fixed number. Watching videos is not nearly as bad as social media. So it's not like screen time is so terrible. But if you don't work out a time budget, these things are always more interesting than anything else to the kids. They're always more interesting than going outside and seeing if there's someone to play with. So if you don't have a time budget with your kid, this thing is going to suck up 6 to 8 hours a day, and then there's no time for anything else. And so it's very important, I think, to work it out with the kid. Don't just impose it. And actually, one thing I love about Gen Z is that they're actually pretty realistic. Like, you talk to them about device use, they're not in denial. They know these things are messing them up, and they want help in having a healthier relationship with technology and with each other. A lot of them are very lonely. A lot of them want to connect, but like at school, you can't connect because even in between classes, you know, the kids are doing this. So you have no chance to talk. So they are often quite lonely. And if you bring them into the conversation, I think they have a lot of good ideas about how to make things better.
That's really interesting. I mean, then maybe ironically enough, that loneliness might be a good first step in actually fixing the problem.
Yeah, talking about it honestly. I mean, you know, most people are hurting. A lot of people are hurting today. A lot of people are lonely. A lot of us feel something is wrong. And we have to figure this out together.
Yeah. Well, I think the ideas in your book are a great first step towards doing that. So once again, everybody, the book is The Coddling of the American Mind. Jonathan Haidt, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, what a pleasure, Jeremy. Thanks for having me on.